Our next speaker here, Aldo Faisal. And Aldo Faisal is a professor, now I don't know exactly what is your title here, AI and Neuroscience at Imperial College London. And he's also holding a chair at the University of Bayreuth in Bavaria on digital health. And today Aldo is talking about from AI for mental health to digital therapeutics. So Aldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I want to talk to you about work we've been doing over the past 10 years, not just in my lab, but also as part of a larger center that I have the privilege to direct, and that has just been extended its funding by another couple of years. So that's the UKRI Center in AI for Healthcare. Our goal is to advance both fundamental AI questions and solutions specifically developed for healthcare. And to us, the view is that a lot of problems in AI applied to healthcare require partially different type of AI solutions that you would develop, for example, to label your image data or predict your next advertisement. And at the moment, we are at 86 researchers, and we're looking now forward to grow to 210 researchers over the next few years. And we have a fantastic set of industry partners, but also a fantastic set of hospital and medical partners. We're in the UK, so that is the national healthcare system. It's a public healthcare funded system, and we have the 3 major hospital trusts in Northwest London. So this means that we have 2.3 million patients and their data under the hood. If I'm talking about AI, let me just give a very brief definition of that. To us, AI is a question, and when we're talking about AI, we need to think about data. And of course, these days, this is a trivial point, but maybe just a few months ago, before March, the second point was often overlooked, namely that what really matters is also the aspect of agency, systems that can do things, not just tell you what's in the data. And we really believe that AI can do anything a human can do if you have sufficient amount of data. And if we're applying AI to healthcare, we need to talk about what this means for people in healthcare. And to us, it's fundamentally to address the unmet clinical demand that is growing due to the rapid aging of societies, the persistent chronic lack of staff that has the qualifications to help people. And of course, we have challenges such as pandemics and climate change that will further exacerbate the amount of unmet healthcare. And the goal that we have directly is to try to reduce the unmet demand for healthcare. And of course, there's also a cost aspect in there. I think virtually every single major developed economy in the world has healthcare costs growing above the rate of inflation. And for the UK, I can tell you the exact date at which point the percentage of healthcare investment exceeds 100% of GDP. You can directly, beautifully extrapolate that. So we need to find solutions here. So I'm going to talk about AI for health. And in this context, I need to basically slot in where I'm going to position myself in this talk. So at the moment, if you look into mental health, there's this whole beautiful field of computational psychiatry that basically divides up into 2 areas. One is I would call theory-based approaches, where people have theories of how the brain works. We're talking here computational neuroscience, ideas around the Bayesian brain, algorithmic reinforcement learning, reward processes that we can model that operate in the human brain algorithmically and so forth. And there's been a lot of beautiful work there. And it's a bit like physics. You have theoretical physics, it explains you how things work, and then you can build machines that work better and do more wonderful things. There's another camp, and that's, so to speak, the data-driven camp that says, oh, I don't care so much about the mechanisms, maybe because the system is so complex. And if we just start working with the data, how far can we push ourselves in? So this is, for example, applications, diagnostic classification, predictment of treatment responses, what treatments you should provide, and so forth. And so, for example, in the mental health domain, there's been beautiful work linking how symptoms are grouped into family, that there's an underlying structure to that. And of course, ultimately, we will need to combine these 2 approaches. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm an ex-computational neuroscientist, and are going to expound the idea of to be as data-driven as possible. And so when we can approach the problem from a purely data-driven perspective, what we can do is start thinking overcoming silos that we have in our education as medics, as psychologists, as therapists, as scientists, where, for example, you may be in the psychiatry, neurology, cardiology, or gastroenterology silo and are thinking about disease and treatment of patients in your own school of thought. But of course, currently, we're seeing that, for example, in the domains of polypharmacy, how to manage and handle the multiple prescription of drugs, when we're looking at multimorbidity treatments, for example, links between cardiovascular disease and depression, or microbiome interactions. Again, there's growing literature of work how your gut interacts with your mental health disorder. We're seeing that these silos are not really helpful and may actually limit how we're thinking. And ultimately, we're thinking in silos because the problem is very complex, and we're approaching it with our, let's be generous, simple human mind that has just a certain amount of concepts and data in their hand and likes to reason in a certain way. But that's not necessarily the way nature is actually working. And so AI-driven methods can hopefully give us the perspective to think about health and well-being in a more holistic way. And I don't mean it in the esoteric sense. I'm meaning in a radical data-driven view where we're trying to overcome human induction biases and preconceptions to think about treatments. And I just give you a small example of that. So in the UK, we have the UK Biobank, which is a database of 500,000 people, where we have their complete genetic and healthcare information data from all treatments, from primary care, secondary care, and social care, and we can start mining that database. So in this domain, we applied a simple clustering model, or I should be more precise, a topic model. So an algorithm that takes basically different descriptions of what diseases a patient have, in this case, the ICD-10 codes, and basically looks, are there common topics of diseases that fall together? So we're looking at what diseases, and people suffer often from multiple diseases, how are they grouped together? And so you get here, in this case, the maximum values that you find 30 clusters ideally describing, or 30 topics describing that data set. And what I've now done here is picked out one cluster and just give you, a set of diseases that often go together. For example, you may have angina pectoris with this feeling of constriction of the heart together with the risk of heart attack. That's not a surprising cluster per se. Or you have here aspects of diabetes, that you may be obese, maybe you're very fat, so you can't sleep well, so you have sleep apnea, and so forth. And so there's no big surprise that some of these things are obviously linked. But when you go through 500,000 data points, you actually find that there's a deeper structure in there. So I'm now just showing you the clustering again. And what I've color-coded here is what group of disease patients belong to. And I want to draw your attention to group number 5, which is the category of psychiatric and behavioral, or mental and behavioral disorders. And now we find in every single cluster that is a physiological classic disease of the heart, the lung, or something else, we find that there are topics that include in every single cluster diseases from the spectrum of mental and behavioral disorders. Right? Just to shape your awareness that if we're thinking of disease, we should not think about it in an isolated manner. And so this is what a data-driven view can offer you, and trying to overcome some of the silos. So let's take this further. I want to show you a different aspect. And that's the idea of how are we using AI mainly in healthcare at the moment. So at the moment, we're effectively doing what I call perceptual AI. We're trying to mimic the perceptual abilities of human clinicians to diagnose or, for example, monitor disease. And that's, you have some setting typically where you have sensory information, situational information, contextual information, and you have a decision maker or an operator that makes a single action or decision. And that's, for example, a radiologist looking at an MRI scan of the brain, or your phone hearing the sounds of your voice, or, for example, a doctor ausculting your chest and trying to work out what type of disease you may have from how you're coughing. And that's typical single decision-making that imitates the ability of humans to perceive information. And so what I've listed here is a range of papers that shows you how we're using AI for diagnostics. And there's one collective criterion I used on these papers, and that's simply papers that claim that we achieve above human expert performance, so that the AI systems after training perform better than individual doctors or group of doctors. And that's great, and they've been very eye-catching in the newspapers. But the interesting thing that you should look at here is this value here, the area under the curve, or the AUC. That is a number between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100% if you want. If it's 100%, you get everything right. If it's 0%, you get everything wrong. And now you see that these systems operate at above human performance level, but they're doing that at 67%. 82%. Now, no one of you would use a typewriter that gets every fourth letter wrong, or every fifth letter wrong, or every third letter wrong. But that's currently above human performance level. So it opens the question, what is actually the human performance level? And that's not so much being investigated. As AI researchers, we need to compare ourselves against the human. And so this is interesting questions that are arising here. Now, why is the human performance not so high? Right? Why is it not 99.99%, like in my ability to understand the spoken word? And that's partially to do with in how we're diagnosing disease. And so for that, I want to take you down the rabbit hole of what we call digital biomarkers. So this is the idea that you can use the data exhaust from digital devices, wearables, implantables, ingestibles, to define new endpoints of disease progression or a diagnosis that tells you this person is sicker than before. And this has been hailed as a big advancement. There's not a lot of AI in here. It's just digital devices collecting digital data. In a provocative way, it's dumb sensors. And the problem is that these digital biomarkers have very poor evidence in operation. What's going on? So only 12% of digital biomarkers have any evaluated clinical effectiveness. So the vast majority is just proposed to work, we don't know why. A third of them were published in journals with no impact factor. That tells you, I think, a lot, because it means you can get everything published these days. And the vast majority of them was published in journals with an impact factor lower than 5, which in the medical field is a really low value. And they often have poor clinical robustness. So when they're being deployed, for example, by digital health companies in different settings, then you find that the robustness has often scores of, 40% had scores of 0. So there was no repeatability in the results. And ultimately that is because we have a lack of underpinning approaches and know-how for using these digital biomarkers in the context of AI. There's a lack of principle. And that's a big challenge, because if you want to apply digital biomarkers in drug development, and that's their big promise, they fail to realize the challenges. So drug development is risky, slow, and expensive. We're talking these days around $2.6 billion to develop one drug and take it to market. They have 96% failure rate, so you have this amazing new compound. 96% of the time it will go nowhere, and it typically takes 10 years to get to market. At the same time, given these costs and risks for pharmaceutical and biotech companies in developing treatments, we have over 9,000 diseases without effective treatments. And even the leading drugs work only in 30 to 50% of all patients. And so the question is, can we think about biomarkers better? And as the previous speaker beautifully highlighted, we have behavior. And we believe that behavior is ultimately the phenotype that characterizes the human condition best. Why? Well, first of all, from an evolutionary perspective, it is changes in your behavior that improve or decrease your evolutionary fitness. So your entire genetic, proteomic, connectomic networks are optimized for this case. And ultimately, your behavior is a driver of health. If you have one more cigarette, or if you go into the fast food, that all determines your health. So clearly, there must be signals in our behavior that we're not looking at it with current modalities. And so I'm showing you here now an example from my colleague Nicholas Troyer's beautiful work on, this should be playing, on what we call biological motion. So you don't see this person, you just see their joints moving. But let's do a bit of pop psychology here. So this is the average person. Now let's look at this person in a happy mood. I hope you can see that the person is walking happily. Same person at same walking speed, walking sadly. Me on a good day. me on the way to the airport. Right, so you can see with your human eyes, and you're trained to analyze and understand these things, of course, because it's essential for human cooperation to understand these things, that there is information about your mental health status and a lot of other things. The question is, when we go on about and ask, what does natural healthy behavior look like? You find something very embarrassing happening. You consult textbooks, and they will tell you, for example, that the two most important hand motions are the precision pincer grip and the power grasp. And then you chase down who actually set that or measured that, and you end up 300 years ago in a village in England where some country doctor wrote an essay that self-evidently these are the most important hand movements. Now, when we then started actually putting digital devices on people to measure all the movements that people do, we discovered that modern Imperial College students don't do a precision pincer grip throughout 24 hours of wear. And so our assumptions about fundamental things that are relevant for human behavior are unknown. That's embarrassing, because these days I can get myself sequenced, I can do proteomic and protein structure prediction, I can do large-scale connectomics, but I know almost nothing about human behavior. And so over the years, we set up a whole pipeline of work of what we call live-in labs. These are flats that we rent, that we fully digitize, and we observe human behavior to the highest possible resolution. Every joint angle, if the participants consent, we have scene cameras with eye trackers, that's what you see in the top right. We have the full skeletal reconstruction, we know what they're looking, and we have loads of other nice and interesting sensors in that flat that gives us something about, so to speak, the ecology of what they're doing. Okay, so you can do that with healthy people, and you can do that with diseased people. Okay, that's data-driven. There's no deeper mechanistic questions we're asking. We're just pushing the idea, how far can I push this data aspect? So at the moment, if you're being assessed for a disease, for example, it's what's a very popular test is the 6-minute walk test. So I get you to walk for 6 minutes, and I measure how many meters you walk. And if your disease progresses, you walk fewer meters. That's used, for example, for various lung diseases, for muscular diseases, and also for some neurological diseases. The problem comes now that, for example, for some diseases, we know that if you walk 50 meters less, then your disease has progressed in these 6 minutes. But if I give you a drug or a drug candidate, and you manage to walk the same amount of distance that last time we tested you, then the drug works. And the problem is, if I give you $20 at the end of the walk and ask you to walk as fast as you can, you will also walk 20 meters more, those 50 meters more. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of assessments, especially in the psychiatric but also neurological domain, are often subjective by eye assessments. I look at you, maybe I have a stopwatch to measure how long it takes you, but they're very crude measures, because why would the distance you can walk in 6 minutes be the best descriptor of your disease state? And so effectively, we have, for example, here the red patients and the blue healthy controls, and we're mapping that on some scale that some human defined 150 years ago as being a good disease scale. And then, it turns out you can't distinguish the blues from the reds so easily. So then came digital biomarkers and the idea, let's capture it digitally, because that's really the improvement that we can do. Fine, so you remove the measurement noise. It's, so to speak, more objective. There's no more stopwatches here. But still, the problem is that what you're measuring against is poor. You're assessing against walking while you want to know something about, dementia, for example. So here AI becomes interesting, because now we can start thinking about looking at the patients as they are in their behavioral space, but find a better axis against which we can project their disease state. So for example, if we look at this assessment here, clearly the red from the blues are easily distinguishable. Only what is this other assessment? Or should there be only one assessment? And so, of course, because we want to make useful technologies, we need to think about how to take these technologies all the way back to the human-defined scales. That's what the FDA, the EMA, the regulators require for approving drugs. And we can think about that. And I'm just going to show you an example of what we've been doing. So this is a disorder in children, a genetic disorder that leads to death at around age 20. It's called Duchenne. And here you're seeing a child performing, with consent of the parents, recorded and visible, a standard assessment that children need to undergo to know whether their disease has progressed or not. This is a disease that has no disease-modifying treatment at the moment. And this is the same kid playing in their playroom, playing. Okay? So what we were interested in is trying to find descriptors, what we call behavior fingerprinting, that allows us, and I'll use the technical term, to tokenize human behavior into what we call a language of behavior and analyze its structure. And so we have discovered a whole space of natural human behavior out of the healthy phenotype we characterized in our live-in labs, and that allows us then to define a single pipeline that will work for the child performing the clinical assessment and the child just playing in their playroom in their daily life. And the critical thing is, we can, for example, predict disease progression with twice the precision just using the behavioral data than with using the FDA gold standard biomarker. And as you're going to see by the end of my first half of the talk, the gold standard is fairly leaden. The other important thing is we can also do this exercise, and we got data here from large-scale clinical trials about the FDA-approved biomarker and the precision with which they were able to predict disease progression. So we could basically vary the size of the study population synthetically. And you see that, of course, the more kids you add, the more precise you get, but this 6-minute walk biomarker plateaus at around 65 kids, and that's the minimum trial size expected by the FDA. Now, the interesting thing with our behavioral biomarker, we call it ethomics, an analogy to genomics. We're looking at natural behavior of people in their daily life. We can achieve the same precision with 9 children, and we can exceed the precision of measurement with 12 children. So this means now, because we can predict disease states 6 months into the future, that we have effectively half the trial duration, which means for 3 stages of FDA approval, you can go from a 6-year trial to a 3-year trial, and for a number of kids, you can go from a large cohort to a much smaller cohort, and that's important for drug development. And so we published this at the start of the year in Nature Medicine. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is what happens when you have, for example, genetic aspects and more interesting proteomic aspects. So genes is basically what's on your hard disk when you're operating as a living being, and proteins is what's in the RAM, right? So that's what's currently happening in you. And we, of course, know that genes, but more interesting proteomics and dysregulation of proteomics leads to disease. Now, the interesting thing is that we can now apply exactly the same pipeline of processing. And this is a video that should be playing, but is not. Let's see whether that gets it to work. Yeah. So this is an adult case. So these are people suffering from Friedreich's. It's a neurodegenerative disease, develops at around 20, leads to death around 45 to 50. And again, we are monitoring here people in their daily life. In this case, the person has been hanging out in the living room, and we're monitoring that. Identical pipeline of analysis, analytic way of processing the behavioral data. And now the interesting thing here, we can do everything that I showed you in the previous case with the precision of prediction and so forth. But now comes something interesting, because it's a disorder that dysregulates the expression of frataxin, which is a gene that regulates mitochondrial energy levels in cells, including those of the brain. We can actually start to ask, well, if I take the FDA-approved gold standard biomarkers for these patients that we measured at 3 moments in time, 0 months, 9 months, and 18 months, I should be able to predict what your gene expression level is based on the FDA-approved marker. After all, it's the gold standard for capturing the disease. And our best efforts, and this is with the GP regressors and a lot of hyperparameter tuning, produces this result. The measured level of frataxin is not correlated with anything that we can predict from the FDA-approved biomarkers. Okay, so now we take our pipeline that I showed you also for the kids, pipe that through, and lo and behold, with an R-square of 0.82, we can reconstruct gene expression. And that was our second Nature Medicine paper in the year. And effectively, what this shows is there's so much information in daily life human behavior. If you're not afraid of embracing the richness of human behavior, that you can start doing what we now call behavioral transcriptomics. No blood samples needed. we can track variations in gene expression to a certain extent from changes in behavior. And we believe we can apply that also to mental health. In fact, I can also show you some examples why this marker works. So first of all, I'm showing you here a method for visualizing the complexity of human behavior on a two-dimensional map. And you see here dots. The dots here are very faint, that's why you can't see them, but here they're high-density regions of these dots. And then I can show you what's the coverage of the clinical biomarkers. And these clinical biomarkers are advertised as activities of daily living because they capture our life in its full complexity. And you see they just cover a very narrow region of the state space. And that's a huge problem. Similarly, another problem that we have is the biomarkers for the kids that I showed you. They're suffering from a neurodegenerative disease that basically, systematically kills the neuromuscular system. The FDA-approved biomarkers, showing you here too, the 6-minute walk, but also the North Star assessment here on the left. You see the markers go up and then go down again, where low means you're really sick and up means you're really healthy. And that has nothing to do with the marker, that has simply to do with children as they approach the age of 7 or 8. They just become more dexterous, let's put it that way, than children that are 4. But these children are suffering from a disease that makes them progressively more discoordinated. So another example where the gold standard simply plainly fails to capture truly what you're doing. Now, our biomarker, in contrast, and again, the biomarkers basically just learned of the data. There was not a lot of brain juice going into that we used a Bayesian optimization method to find across all possible ways of marking the disease. The optimal biomarker is a marker that for these very same children systematically progresses within the range of measurement that we have had a chance to see, and that will approach 0 when they're basically on a ventilator because their breathing muscles also stop to work. Again, the same pipeline, we can also apply it in acute stroke ward. So this is an ongoing study that we're doing where we're measuring the state of patients with our motion and behavioral sensors. And I just show you here some of the raw data that you're seeing. And again, there's so much information in the state of the patient that we can predict if they're going to have a second stroke or develop unforeseen complications while in the stroke ward with 81% accuracy. And this without knowing their gender, their age, or what disease they have. While if we throw all the predictors that we could pull from the database of the patient, we just achieve 63% prediction accuracy. There's a lot of information in behavior. And so the challenge that we're facing in a lot of domains, is, such as psychiatry and neurology, is that we're assessing people by eye, being subjective in the rater. So we see interpersonal, but also intrapersonal variations. We do that in an artificial setting in the clinic where patients may not feel comfortable. It's context, mood, weather, situationally dependent. And ultimately, the problem is that we're comparing you in your diagnosis or your monitoring to the average. But the goal of going to do it by AI, not by eye, is that we can go in an objective manner, that we don't have to be afraid of variability in human behavior because we can use personal variations to drive the signal. We can collect this information in daily life, so in your natural habitat, or we would call it politely patient-centric view. We can exploit and, so to speak, average out variations in context, mood, weather, and other contexts. And ultimately, we can compare you to you. Because what I've not told you, that in these two Nature Med papers, we were able to predict every single patient's individual disease trajectory. And so that's the richness of information that you have there. So let's take a step back. We're going to still stick to human behavior, but let's look at the other side. Let's look at the clinician side. So we spoke about before perceptual AI, looking at the patient and getting a diagnosis. So diagnosis is just the start. Once I know what you have, I need to treat you and cure you, right? And so if you think about that, that requires intervention. So planning, managing, adjusting what you're doing to people. And so ultimately, we're closing the loop. You have things that you're doing, two things, right? You prescribe a drug, you send them through a therapy, you make them walk in the park, and that changes the state of the patient. And so when you make decisions, you need to plan and strategize what is the best set of actions. And here we're using in the term, in the context of what we call reinforcement learning that you heard above before, the context of how can we basically learn what to do with the patients. And so the example here, it's a sequential decision-making problem where you make many decisions one after another. It can be the surgeon who needs to decide how he's cutting through your brain to get to the tumor. It can be thought of in the context of the ship captain that has to get from, Washington to New York and has to make many decisions. Not all of them are carried out by herself or himself, but he may instruct humans or machines to do things for them. And of course, ultimately, the British butler who reads your mind and knows what you want and need before you even say that, right? So this is the type of problem that we want to look at. And there's a very practical need for that, and that's the need to deal with the unwanted variation in practice. So at the start, I showed you the, by computer science standard, low classification performance of human expert clinicians in diagnosing disease. Here I'm now showing you the variation in treatments. So this is work we have done with 45 clinicians, expert trained clinicians, where we presented them with 30 cases of 30 different patients. And we asked them, you're now facing this patient in the ward. You have 2 drugs to prescribe. I'll later say what this is, but for now just stick to the story. And I can prescribe something called fluids and something called vasopressors. And so what these plots show you, so one row is one patient, that for example, this patient across 45 clinicians had 500% in variation in the dosage of the drug. Okay? 500%, 500%. And there was sort of less variation in this other drug, but there are other patients where there was substantial variations. So it feels sort of, this is unwanted. Yeah? Maybe not all of these prescriptions are good ideas. And maybe, we know some doctors who are better, some colleagues who are better, and some colleagues who are a bit more challenged, right? So how do we need to think about that? Again, because we need to do AI and compare ourselves to AI systems, we actually measure these quantities. And so what we're now talking about is not digital biomarkers, but what we called digital therapeutics. And specifically, a system that we call the AI clinician. So that's a system that learns from retrospective data, not from interaction, using off-policy policy estimation for reinforcement learning, how to prescribe drugs so as to keep patients alive in intensive care unit. And the big challenge here is that patients in intensive care units suffer from something called sepsis. That's an infectious disease. And it's the biggest killer in intensive care units, it's the biggest killer in hospitals, and it's the most expensive hospital-treated condition in the US and in any major economy worldwide. In the UK alone, 38,000 people die from it every year without COVID. Every patient who died from COVID in intensive care unit died with sepsis. And the problem is it's an infectious disease, so you can treat it with antibiotics. The problem is your cardiovascular system collapses before. And that brings us to these 2 drugs, vasopressors, that's stuff that constricts your blood vessels and props up your blood pressure, and IV fluids, that's just filling up the balloon with more water to keep your blood pressure working. And it's an interesting setting because there's no mathematical model of the entire cardiovascular system because the amount of fluid that you have depends on infectious reactions and so forth. And there's no clear model. And that's why human experts have no clear common solution strategy. Yeah? And that is also what you have in many other cases where you have white-collar experts making decisions in poorly described state and action spaces, including psychiatry. So what we did is, and this is already the second version of the system, we trained the system on a publicly available database and also on our hospital database with tens of thousands of patients. There's a lot of AI that I'm going to skip over here, but basically what we're doing is this following process. And forgive me for gamifying this. Imagine there's a game world and the patient has developed sepsis and you need to steer them so that they're discharged and survive 90 days after being released from intensive care unit, and you want to steer them away from the death state. So in this case, it's fairly simple to work out what your policy is. So in every state of this grid world the patient is in, you know what to do. Yeah? You can do that, A, because this grid world is very easy. B, you know how the playing field looks like, and you know that if you go up, you end up. In our case, we have 60 physiological variables describing the patient, blood tests, blood pressure, heart rate, whatever. So you need to find a state description, and then you need to work out how combinations of drugs, think polypharmacy, will result in a state change that is desirable or not. Okay. So we can now go into the depths of what we have been developing over now 7 years in terms of machine learning methods. The best that we can do is now something that we call Bayesian distributional policy gradients. That's a method for the aficionados that's fully Bayesian in the parameters and is distributional. So we have also an uncertainty of the rewards, and we're now currently working on getting the action distribution out of this. Basically, we can now visualize that. And so what you're seeing here is a landscape of the patient's state. And a patient may now move through this state due to disease or due to interventions by the doctors. And what you're seeing here are the red arrows that indicate in which direction certain interventions that were done, the patient was being pushed. Right? In this case, we have a patient that was not treated and basically followed a trajectory, and then sort of when it became really bad, they started to steer against that. And what I didn't say here is the blue regions are regions of high mortality, and the red regions are regions of low mortality. This is a visualization tool we developed to visualize, to provide a cognitive map of what clinicians in this field can only describe through words. And it's very interesting to look at handover protocols where one clinician is talking to another clinician, because it's very anecdotal, but they're actually describing a very complex state space and transition. Now, what's interesting here is two things. So first of all, I can plot here the difference between the dosage that the AI recommended retrospectively to the dosage that humans gave. And the good news in this plot here on the vasopressor side is that the more the humans disagreed with AI, the higher was the mortality for the patient. So this means that our AI has learned something. This result here is actually more interesting because there was disagreement, and so the AI was, so to speak, this means that the behavior of the clinician was less optimal. But if they underdosed by up to a liter, there was no increase in mortality. And so I got a bit concerned. Maybe our model had not captured the right thing. But our wonderful intensive care collaborators said, no, Aldo, a paper just came out. They did a clinical randomized controlled trial of underprescribing fluids by 1 liter. And it had no change in mortality. Now that's interesting because this is information, these curves, that we learned out of operational data. Yeah, retrospective analysis of operational data. Now I'm not arguing against randomized controlled trials, of course not. But the important thing is it's the way that we can use AI systems to prime and figure out key candidate elements. And of course, I'm talking about modeling the perception-action loop of clinicians, right? Clinician looks at the patient, makes an action. So effectively, we have here a cognitive process, a cognitive model. We're doing computational cognitive neuroscience of decision-making in clinicians in a very practical way. So we can do things. We can look at the implied out-of-bag feature importance for the different parameters that clinicians were looking at. So why did you prescribe this moment this drug? What were the most important features that drove you to that? And you find here now these 60 different values that you have in the ICU. And for example, you find here partial O2 pressure as one of the candidates. It doesn't matter what these labels are. The important thing is that if you look what the AI was driven by in its decision, you find, first of all, that this label, there's no single value people were paying attention to. The AI system paid attention to more values equally. It has also a different rank order of what physiological variables were important. And it's even more dramatic for the vasopressors, where clinicians looked at 4 numbers, and the AI system looked at around 12 numbers with high weight. Again, I need to be very clear here. These are highly trained people. When they make such a decision, and I've watched them doing that, they spend 2 to 5 minutes poring over the patient chart, sweating and thinking very, very hard about this. Yeah? They're under time pressure, and there's a finite amount of bit rate our brain can intake about physiological values. There's also such a thing as training, for example, because there's a specific definition that is just driven by a single parameter value, because somebody said, this is the thing you need to pay attention to, right? And all these biases we discover here. Now, we had a pandemic. There were not enough ICU doctors, so now the AI clinician system is in deployment in 4 London intensive care units. And it's to my best knowledge, the first digital therapeutic system in operation where we're evaluating it clinically. And so this brings us now to a whole new aspect of how we do the work. This is in St. Mary's Hospital, and this is a clinician wearing an eye tracking system head-centered. So we are seeing what they're seeing. I'm not showing the eye tracking dots here. This is an ICU dummy, so it's not a real human. It's a robotic dummy that breathes and has a heart rate and can be programmed to mimic what we want. This is so I can show you. I cannot show you a real patient there. And this is the standard ICU data they're looking at. And we then ask them for the dosage, and that's the AI clinician's interface, where it basically says, in this moment, you should prescribe these 2 drugs in this dosages, and these are 4 ways I explain my decision to you, human. Okay? And then we ask them, given that you've seen now what the AI says, do you want to change your decision? And do you actually think it's critically unsafe? And in this study, and then they leave again, like they would on the regular ward. So this is now where we're looking at the human condition in facing these decisions. So we've done eye tracking, right? And we have QR codes everywhere. So we know exactly at what information they looked and what information they did not look. Yeah? People complain in generative AIs about hallucinations. Well, in cognitive neuroscience, we call it confabulation, where you retrofit the explanation. And we had cases where clinicians said, no, because of this and this that I changed my opinion. And we know that you didn't look at this and this. Yeah? Again, I need to be very respectful to my clinical colleagues, because it's a very hard work. But I think these are the tricks that our mind plays with us. And so what I'm showing you here is the feature importance, so to speak, or how much time clinicians were spending when they were looking at different aspects, the patient manager, the vital signs monitor, the ICU chart, or the AI screen. Now, what we did in this case is we programmed the AI clinician to perform normally or do really unsafe stuff. Not blatantly obvious unsafe, but unsafe. Yeah, where a junior doctor would be scolded if they were to do that. And turns out, in the behavioral perceptual aspect, there was no significant difference in the clinicians detecting differences between these 2. We found that clinicians stopped unsafe recommendations 78% of the time. That's great. 22% of the time they did not stop. We had, interestingly, also the case where they can stop and ask for help for a more senior clinician to come into place. That happened around 85% of the time. And the interesting thing is they stopped safe recommendations as being unsafe. Where, again, these were designed by ICU clinicians, the interventions that the system recommended to be one or the other. And this is just to show you what I just mentioned earlier. Oops. That the actual and the reported attention that they placed on things did not correlate with each other. So where does it leave us? I've showed you examples of AI-based recommendations. And what we ultimately want to think about is, and I gave you just 2 examples of that, how we can think about more holistically managing health and well-being across the health span. Yeah? Not giving you maximum life, but giving you a very healthy life for your life expectancy. And I've given you 2 specific examples. I've shown you how we can get very high resolution state descriptions of the patient using behavioral biomarkers derived from natural behavior, something that we call doing ethomics. And I showed you an example how in a very different domain we can intervene on patients in such a way that we can optimize their outcomes. And the AI clinician system is predicted to reduce mortality by 8% in the UK, or 4,000 lives if it were rolled out in all 221 ICUs. So this brings us, so to speak, to the closing of the talk. What I wanted to highlight, and I'm not have time to show you, is that I've shown you is basically slices of data we can collect. It's obvious that if you bring more data together, it will help you more. If we're talking about mental health, your social media activity, your emotion activity, environmental factors, gut activity will be linked in some way. It's obvious. Yeah, we live embedded, embodied in the real world. So getting these information together is important. And this also can us now bring to think about how we want to deliver health and care. Our current model, our economic model for health, is mainly driven by the healthcare system generates revenue by treating your disease. Can we think with the same technologies that I've exemplified you about making prevention the primary driver to deliver health? There's, of course, a difference. If you're in a private healthcare system, it's not as good. If you're a public-funded healthcare system, the citizens can simply vote that we want to maximize or minimize the risk of disease occurrence in the first place. What I've shown you is that we want to do things not in the lab or in the clinic. We want to do it in the wild. We believe that the way forward is not to be open loop, but closed loop in treatment. And we want to avoid human induction bias and be data-driven. And ultimately, this is Picasso's beautiful depiction of the lady on the beach in all its richness and liveliness. And, we seem to be doing this at the moment. We're breaking down the human into its constituents, elements, and it's, I'm sure, very organized and structured by the Swiss artist Ulf Werli. But I believe that if we apply AI right, we can overcome some of our human limitations or unease with complex things and go back from the post-genomic human to look at the full human. And with that, I thank all my funders and an amazing research group. Thank you very much.
Wow, we've covered quite a large area here. And I can see already there are people who have questions. Please.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous. I lead digital health policy for the American Psychiatric Association, and I have 500 questions, and I'm going to ask you my most boring one, and I apologize. So this may have been later on in your talk, but in the American regulatory environment right now, we're really struggling with the definition of a digital therapeutic. And the one that seems to be rising to the top is a software-based, kind of non-clinician mediated product that can replicate the efficacy of a pharmaceutical. And so I have a couple of questions. One is, the biggest question, I think, is how we test the effectiveness. And those products are not being subject to the same rigor as a pharmaceutical would in clinical trial. And it seems like a lot of the markers that you're identifying may be really valuable for a new frame for understanding effectiveness. And so is that a direction that your research is taking, both the products and the new ways of thinking about establishing effectiveness? Sorry.
Great question. So let's start with the regulators. So our center has been working since 2019 with the entire regulatory pipeline of the UK, so MHRA, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, Care Quality Commission, and so forth. And we've been doing joint training exercises because the UK is highly motivated and having proactive and not reactive regulators. And so we had already a number of AI sandboxes in the UK where we could basically try and deploy things. So I think that's talking to each other is an important aspect in this. I think if we're talking about specific deployment and regulation, what I've shown you up here is in both cases, AI is a medical device, a medical software device. So that's within the regulatory framework. What we should be talking about in the domain of mental health is that, of course, the well-being aspect, which is not medical or clinical in that sense, but I think it's also an important aspect. And here we need to talk about the safety of patients, that they're not treated by somebody who just coded up and is now following by it. But at the same time, keeping everything under a tight regulatory landscape makes it very hard. So we did the first work, the digital biomarker work, effectively 5 years ago. It came out now because we were trying to find out a regulatory compliant way to patent the technology so that actually somebody would actually use it, because an unpatented biomarker is not further developed because there's no worth protection in the development for it. And so there are some hurdles here. So we need to think about how we can carefully move from the clinical to the non-clinical domain and back, or from the regulated to the unregulated one.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Hi, this is Yixue Zhao from University of Southern California Information Sciences Institute. I like so many things about your talk. Like her, I'm gonna try to only ask one question. So one thing I particularly like is about in the wild and versus the lab. Actually, this year there's a paper coming out that they are arguing that these are two very different problem domains, and they tried to use a lot of prediction models from the lab applied to like in the wild data performs very badly, right? Because we perform very differently. So I'm super, super interested in the daily lives, because when we talk about mental health, essentially we really need to understand the day-to-day. So you talked about the behavioral source of data in the daily lives, like natural behavior. There's also like, brain part of the data, like there's portable EEG caps and stuff. But essentially, they're still kind of intrusive. Like I cannot wear a whole suit or a cap to go out shopping. You know what I mean? If we want to have really holistic view and understand people's day-to-day, in your opinion, if we try to minimize the intrusive aspect of things to make people not pay attention to those more naturally, what would you say are the most informative sensors or data sources we can draw from to predict like mental state and to understand maybe nearly as well compared to using all sorts of fancy stuff that's more intrusive?
Okay, so if you want to be principled about it, you should go from maximum resolution and then work out how to reduce it. From 17 sensors where you just put one sensor where you should put that. I think that's one aspect. I think that it also is very application dependent. So in the case of these patients, they're dying from a disease for which there's no treatment because it's too high risk for pharma companies to develop a drug. Okay, so they have a very high rate of compliance and retention in the trial. Literally, I think no one dropped out during the trial because it was so important to them and they didn't mind to wear the suit, right? If you're now talking about monitoring your health before you're getting sick in a daily life basis,
yes.
Then we can think about, especially if you're thinking about domestic data sources, you can deploy radar system, you can deploy sort of not overly intrusive systems, and we have them in our flats to monitor people. But ultimately, you want to have some ground truth. Otherwise, it's just, oh, I've developed a new sensor, let's just throw it at it. But we want to have a principled reason why this sensor in which settings will operate or not.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
informative.
Hi, Jay Rickes, research engineer. This was a really amazing talk. I was thinking about a lot of different applications, but I guess I'm thinking also about like regulations and then how do you clearly build bigger data sets by starting as early as possible. I mean, I think a lot of times when we open up apps and, whether we want to or not, we accept the terms and conditions and just to be able to use that app. But I was thinking like, what if you're pregnant, you're about to give birth, and then you accept terms and conditions to be biomarkered on the very beginning. And I mention that because it seems like from, beginning all the way to, old age, there would be a great set of data to really figure out, especially with particular communities, mental health issues or, even educational things.
I think it depends on the model of healthcare. We're in the UK, in a public healthcare system. So this means two things. Everyone goes through the same infrastructure and through the same data. So in London, we have 2.5 million patients in our secure data environment, and we just won a grant to put all of the London data environments together with 10 million. And we foresee that within the next 5 years, we're going to have all 65 million people in one database everything, every heartbeat when you had an echocardiogram, every brain scan, everything someone ever wrote. Okay, and we believe that if we find solutions in this technology, we can actually even potentially partially pay for the cost of the healthcare system with intellectual property we gain from using that data. And that's because it's owned by the people and it's for the people. It's a different model. In other countries with other systems need to operate differently with that. But yeah, from the cradle to the grave is something that is going to happen and is already happening.
Oh, excellent.
Hi, some great talk. This is Madhusudan. I'm transitioning into AI. So, through your live-in lab, were you able to distinguish between normal behavior versus disease behavior and use that information to identify triggers for anxiety, depression, re-traumatization, etc.?
So, great question. We did not, we call that behaviorally sequence patients with mental health disorders in that way. We've done several trials with several hundred patients using just mobile phones and the data we can get from there. And this would have, with more time, would have spoken about. But yeah, we believe that you can get signatures of that. And we believe you can also potentially get, information about switching and bipolar disorder and so forth from changes in this behavior.
Okay, and also to use such information to identify behaviors that support cognitive stimulation?
Yes, so we're working with dementia and Parkinson's patients at the moment to think about what is the optimal trigger. And for that, you just need to, in dementia, for example, know when are you more lucid during the day and when less. And there's a hypothesis here that if I can stimulate you during the lucid moments, it carries over to the non-lucid moments.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Faisal. 2 questions and online. So the first one, so they're asking, so have you identified certain circumstances or ways in which more data could lead to potential harms?
Okay, I'll keep it simple. I think data saves lives if you use it in the right way, protected by data protection standards that put the citizen and their data in the forefront. If you're mindful and very careful about biases. I showed you UK Biobank. It's a great data set, but there's a lot of white, highly educated women in this data set who basically volunteered for that trial. And there are biases in that data. And so we need to be aware of these biases and try to avoid them. So that's why more data needs to be also the right amount of data that you're increasing.
Okay, so another question about, so someone is asking, so he or she was in the field of addiction, and it's a different type of the pandemic. So yeah, so asking for any of the suggestions if you know anyone, so or specific in the lab and working in this area.
So we are not working on addiction, and the question is, what type of technology you want to give a person with addiction to help them? Is it when the system detects that they're, so to speak, in an emotionally frail state, and now having a support call would make a big difference to prevent a relapse? These are potentials we can explore, but again, we need to be very careful. None of this has been studied. These are just ideas I'm throwing here in the air. But I think we can help people, because ultimately what the AI system gives you is, so to speak, like a benevolent angel on your shoulder that looks over you and can nudge you to do the right thing in the right moment.
Thank you.
Mayank.
Hi, I'm Mayank Mehta from UCLA. Great talk. So human beings learn quite often from mistakes. And we can't really look inside our brains to see how did we detect the mistake? What went wrong for us to realize that was a mistake, especially in such complex conditions. But in case of AI, you can look inside. So I imagine there were situations in which your AI agent actually made an error, because nothing is perfect. Is it possible to look inside and find out why that error occurred, which relates to that nice question somebody asked. That too much data can be a bad thing. We know that AI models can be very brittle. And as we increase the number of parameters, the brittleness increases. So can one do something of that sort where one can look inside the AI model and figure out where the errors came from? Was it from some spurious data, so-called nonsense variables, as we call in generalized linear models?
Yeah, okay. So it's ultimately a question about explainability or interpretability.
And then using that further.
So explainability is typically a system that tells you what the system was thinking, as if a third person was looking at the system and telling you, oh, he said this and this because he's like that. What AI Clinician 1.0 was like that, and it was also brittle. AI Clinician 2.0 is far less brittle, because it's Bayesian and deals with variability appropriately, but also because we have in the pipeline that generates the actual recommendations, so to speak, this intermediate representation, this map I showed you, and I've not shown you a lot of it. It looked like a checker, like a snow and pepper type thing, but actually there's a lot more information there that you can clinically interpret in there. And that's basically how you slice and visualize that map that allows clinicians to explore what's happening. So in that way, you can go back in that. If you have questions about traceability, in the case of AI Clinician 2.0, we've lost the traceability because that's basically wrapped into a pipeline of a VAE and a recurrent neural network, so there's not a lot of traceability there. But we don't think that in this case that's necessary. Also because it's highly non-trivial for people to understand what the right thing or the wrong thing to do is from a clinical perspective. So when we did the safety evaluation, we pressed our clinical colleagues to come up with rules of what's unsafe. And somebody wrote down a rule, and then another person said, yeah, but if the patient has diabetes, that's actually okay to do. And we couldn't find a set of simple rules that you can assess for safety, which is very different from aerospace. And if you pull the plane down, it will eventually crash. We don't know the sets of equation in health, and even less so for mental health. So in part of that, our way to modeling that for a decision-making system is also a way of describing it. So you can think about this model as a digital twin of the patient.
Thank you.
So if there are no further questions, I think we can conclude our morning session. And we want to thank Aldo, but also the other speakers for a brilliant opening of this symposium.